us in the energy world should think about that. What does that mean? Where's the puck going on that one? Well, the puck's going to, that's the biggest damn battery in your house. And it could go two ways.
One of the things that we've started to see is pricing methodologies that are priced based upon individual customers' usage.
I would love for the entire state of Texas to be powered by solar, but the fact is it's going to be provided by a number of renewable sources and traditional sources of power.
Hi, thank you all so much for joining today. Really excited to have so many people tuned in for what we think will be a great discussion about the future of the retail energy grid in Texas. My name is Allie Danziger, co-founder and president of Integrate Agency, and I'm excited to introduce you now to my colleague, Danielle Ryan, our vice president of business development.
Thanks, Allie. Integrate is a full-service PR and marketing agency with decades of experience in the retail electricity industry, which is why clients choose to work with us for a myriad of digital and traditional acquisition-based marketing strategies and tactics. Today, we've brought together an excellent panel of industry thought leaders that include Don Whaley, president of Ohm Connect Texas, Becky Klein, principal of Klein Energy, and Cameron Palmer, CEO of Almica Energy. While you are all virtual, we are bringing speakers together live for an interactive, lively panel discussion. With that, I'll turn it over to moderator Aaron Douglas, environmental reporter with the Texas Tribune.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we have a great panel lined up for you. We have Cameron Palmer, as mentioned, CEO of Almica Energy. It's a retail electric provider based in Houston. And we've got Don Whaley, president of Ohm Connect Texas, also a new retail electricity provider in Houston. And then we've also got Becky Klein, who is principal of Klein Energy LLC, energy consulting firm in Austin. She was also previously the chair of the Public Utility Commission in Texas in the early 2000s. So really interested to get started. Let's start off. So I did want to talk a little bit about the Winter Storm Yuri, just to get started, of course. So it seems like, there was the electric market in Texas pre-Winter Storm Yuri in February, and there's the electricity market post-Winter Storm Yuri. And so I want to just start off from a pretty high level. What do you all think were the biggest mistakes by either policymakers or in the years leading up to the storm, or actually during the storm, that led to the energy market crisis in February? And we can start with, let's start with Cameron.
Well, I'll punt the policy over to the experts, but I think the biggest mistake on the rep side is, this is kind of like a fourth standard deviation event. From what I've seen, it's really hard to be able to plan from a hedging perspective. I mean, we're down here in Texas, and even myself, not having any customers just yet on the rep side, when we hear winter storm or things like that, we think of snow for a couple hours, right? And we certainly don't think of natural gas lines failing and freezing like that. I was talking to some folks who actually owned and operated some generation resources, and there was, for example, there was a natural gas, one of the feed pipes didn't have 2 feet of insulation around it, which caused it to fail. So if you think about some of the things that cause some of the failures during the freeze, a freeze just isn't top of mind, top of list for generation checklists when they're getting ready for the season. Same with running a rep. Obviously, we didn't have any customers, but I can tell you with 100% certainty, if we did, we would have been out of business too. Regardless of how much data you have in terms of weather or whatever weather is coming, I've heard a word on the street has it that some of the hedges, whether firm load or paper hedges, weren't performing either because of force majeure or because actual generational assets were offline. So it's kind of random in terms of what happened, but I don't really see how we could have stopped some of these retailers from failing. So in terms of some of the mistakes, I don't know if I would call it a mistake, but I would think I would call it something that happen that was so crazy and outlandish that it would have been very difficult to plan for. And then, on the generational side, there's some things that probably could have been done in terms of weatherization. I'm not a generation expert, but I only know what people talk to me about or what I read, and I know that some windmills and so forth, weren't weatherized, and I know that windmills are in Canada and the north Antarctic places.
There's a lot of different reasons, I guess, of this crisis. Talking to you, Don, what are, in your opinion, on the retail side? Were there mistakes on the retail side that could have been avoided?
Yeah, I really don't think so. This is one of those events, you hear the Black Swan, that's the term that everybody's applying. And it truly was. I mean, I don't know too many homeowners that have asteroid insurance. And it's that sort of improbable outcome that you can insure against anything. It's just how much are you willing to pay against an improbable risk. To Cameron's point, I mean, it was 0 degrees in Central Texas for several days. Those words aren't supposed to all be in the same sentence. And I think that a lot of the weatherization that could have, should have, would have taken place, given the structure we have in this market, we don't have a capacity market. We have a scarcity pricing model.
Right.
And that means I'm going to spend X number of hundreds of millions of dollars to prepare for a highly unlikely event and hope that the scarcity events happen to allow me a return on that investment. So, I mean, some of the problems could be structural in the way our market sits. The gas pipelines, it doesn't seem to get the proper amount of airplay, at least in my opinion. Kurt Morgan, CEO of Vistra, testifying in front of the Senate, said, look, you could have offered anything you wanted to. It wasn't we were holding generation back. We have natural gas combined cycle units that kind of need natural gas to run. And when they didn't have it, they couldn't generate. It's just as simple as that. So I don't know that what this event did, in my mind, is raise an awareness that we have a grid that was built around an operational construct that no longer exists. We have a grid that was built for a large-scale hub and scope generation and large high voltage transmission that radiated out to the load centers. Now we have a much more dispersed and diverse generation fleet. We have more generation that is not responsive to load. And I think the real lesson that we need to learn is that we now need to make load responsive to generation, because if the grid's going to get any smarter, we have to help it, and it's not there yet.
And let's turn to you, Becky. I want to hear from the policy perspective, your experience on the PUC. Do you think that there are things that either in the years leading up to February 2021 or even during the storm that could have been done differently to avoid the big crisis that we saw in February?
Yes, well, this storm has been an opportunity to learn a lot of lessons, but I would say, let me dwindle it down to 3 things that perhaps we could have done differently that may not have completely avoided what we went through, but it certainly could have mitigated the burden on customers with the rolling blackouts that didn't roll, and with the retail electric provider market that really has suffered among many others. But the first thing is, as Cameron mentioned, winterizing. So, we've been complacent in winterizing, and that's because we don't have, as Don had incented, we don't really have market signals or price signals that make it cost beneficial to winterize. We definitely summarize. We want our generators there July through September. So winterizing would have helped. Number 2, I think another aspect of it, today we have almost 50% of our installed capacity is gas, right? And almost 30% of it is wind. If you look at what went offline during that ice storm, it was naturally predominantly gas and predominantly wind. So we need to figure out, as far as a market construct, how we can continue to incent clean, reliable, dispatchable resources and make it economical for that. We've actually had a wholesale market here in ERCOT that on the one hand has been great because out of the 7 independent system operator areas in the United States, we've enjoyed the lowest wholesale pricing, except for our peaks in the summer, which, as Don mentioned, that's when generators rely on. They need that to get a return. But on the other hand, we've had these low wholesale prices because we've had and enjoyed a lot of wind energy, and we're going to see a lot more solar energy, whether it's utility scale, community solar, or rooftop solar. And that's a good thing. But our thermal assets can't compete with $0 offered into the market or negative dollars into the market. So what we've seen over the course of the last 6 and 8 years is a mothballing and decommissioning of plants. And so we need to be able to do a construct that will incent clean, reliable, dispatchable generation assets going forward. The third thing I would say is, it seems so simple, but we've done such a poor job at it, and that is communication. And that is an obligation on everybody's part. By that I mean, whether it's a rep, whether it's a generator, a municipal utility, an electric co-op. I think being able to communicate more effectively to the end use customer, but it's also the regulators. Regulators, speaking to the market participants, regulators speaking to the public, regulators speaking to the media, regulators speaking to other regulators. ERCOT in there as well. And not only do we need a better communication regime, but we need to practice that. We need to practice and exercise tabletop scenarios on how this communication flow is going to go. And so I would say those 3 things would have helped tremendously during the ice storm, even though it wouldn't have cured it. It might have ameliorated it.
Yeah. And Dawn, as you were talking about, you can insure against anything if, depending on the price that you want to pay. Like, you could pay an astronomical price to make sure that you're completely, reduce risk to 0.0001%. But how do you think that having this event actually happen is going to impact how retail electricity providers are planning, how it's going to affect the competition in the ERCOT market? It's unfortunate. The retailers they're basically farmers, right? The weather took absolute control of their business through no fault of their own. Dozens of small retailers, medium-sized retailers, got blown away. So you have, as a rep, you have a load forecast, you have a probability curve. You may hedge 105%, 110%, because it might get hot, it might get cold. But people saw their load shift up by 80%. And I don't know how you insure against that. So from a rep standpoint, from a commodity hedging and price risk hedging, I don't know how you ever protect against an event like this. The good news is that the probability of any of us sitting here seeing another event like this is fairly remote. It's kind of like having another 56-inch rain event like we had in Harvey hanging over it. So, how do you hedge against that? I don't know. I think what we will see, though, is, and to Becky's point, the communication that it is going to involve everybody. We call it a smart grid, but it's just not that bright. So in order for the smart grid to raise its IQ, we're going to have to involve the people who actually use the electricity in responding to generation that can't respond to their load shifts. When you have solar, if it's sunny, it's on. If you have wind, if it's blowing, it's on. But you can't ramp it up and you can't ramp it down like you can a thermal source. You don't have automatic generation control that has traditionally worked in the construct that we have. And so one of the things that I am excited about in bringing the technology OhmConnect has in California is the ability to put the power in the hands of consumers to actually respond to rational signals of load from the market. We'll give them the information, they can act on it, they'll have a fair price, but they'll have the ability to improve their price just by simply engaging in and helping to stabilize the grid going forward. It's, this is a truly, it takes a village type opportunity.
where it's going to take both sides, both the point of input and the point of load, to stabilize this market. And I think that really is the greatest learning that's going to come out of this event in February, is that what we have doesn't work for the construct going forward. You know, those people, Becky said it quickly, but those are important numbers. And we're going to have renewable almost at parity with natural gas by the end of this year. Natural gas is still going to be in the lead, but not by much. You know, we have like 8% coal now. So the two things that we're going to have to depend on is a load following capability of gas, but a pretty static generation source in the renewable side. And the behavior on the load side is going to have to change for us to have any form of stability.
Yeah. And keeping with that sort of consumer side, as you're sort of mentioning, you know, putting some of these decisions in the hands of consumers is what retail electric providers can do. You know, I want to go to you, Cameron, and ask sort of the same question. You know, how do you think this is going to impact competition, but also how is it going to impact the products that you all are offering to consumers?
Yeah, no, that's kind of, the freeze was a very unfortunate event for a lot of people, but some of the things that, you know, I've been working on since we started Almica Energy, and it sounds like Ohm Connect is doing something similar, is this is the best proof point that, you know, we could have had. So in terms of the competitive space, I think it's pretty bad. I think as a competitive market, we lost a little bit of trust. You know, we have a little bit of egg on our face, regardless of if we could have prevented this issue or not. And, you know, I do want to tip my hat to ERCOT, though. I think they've, you know, the council there has done a absolute phenomenal job in terms of facilitating as many transactions as they could to prevent retailers that have failed going polar. It's my personal opinion that, you know, reps going polar is the absolute worst thing that could happen, right? It's essentially a de facto sign that our grid failed, right? And as a market participant, I don't want that to happen. But to your question about products and you know, how the consumers will participate going forward, I think that's what I'm most excited about. You know, sometimes with you know, trying to change this market has been very difficult, or you know, make improvements has been really difficult because power has been so cheap. That's kind of what everybody's gravitating towards. How cheap can we get it? But we're losing the cheap, you know, with going through the cheapness, we're losing the innovation, I think. You know, Gritty, it's unfortunate that they've gone out of business, but I think they've done some really, really great things in terms of being able to put the power of decision making in the hands of the consumer. Obviously, you know, it didn't work out perfectly, but I think they did a lot of good things in terms of innovation. But going back to kind of what we're working on is we're first a renewable energy company. We just got our rep license to be able to serve power. But at the end of the day, our mission and goal is to put the generation side back on the consumer's hands. So by either installing rooftop solar and battery systems or serving green energy. So at the end of the day, you know, demand response has been around for a very long time, but I think on the consumer side, the buy-in has been relatively low. You know, we have tons of data either on the residential or consumer side, but it's been very difficult to get consumers to actually act on the data that we give them. I think, you know, going back to Gritty, that's one of the big things that they were able to do. Gamification was huge there. But our mission is to, you know, using data and building trust with the consumers, really control it for them based on their needs and wants. So, you know, for example, a customer with a solar or battery or both in their home, along with, you know, Nest thermostats and different dispatchable assets they may have in their home, they can now take advantage of either pricing events or load shedding events in the market and be a part of the generation side. I think, you know, if we had that at scale in February, you know, we obviously would have had failures across the board, but I don't think it would have been as bad. We wouldn't have had as many outages, clearly. So we're really excited about the opportunity to be able to build platforms where consumers can participate in load shedding, demand response, pricing events, things like that, and not actually have to change their behavior, because it's been really hard in Texas to do that.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, Becky, about this. What can policymakers do to encourage this sort of consumer participation and getting consumers more aware of how we can conserve energy or how we can participate in the energy transition, that sort of thing?
Sure. So let me too, if I may, just respond to with the retail electric providers and their future here in the market.
Yeah.
Because I think whether you're a current rep or whether you're going to be an incoming new rep in the market in the future, you have three headwinds in front of you. Number one is you're going to have to post, especially new ones, more collateral than you did before going forward. Number two, it's probably going to be a higher cost of capital for you because lenders are going to look at this market with a bit more risk than they did before. And number three is that you have some, near monopoly reps right now. Two of them have over 60% of the market. So you're really going to have to be savvy of how you're going to be able to come into the market and, figure out what your beachhead is and capture some market share, which I think ultimately policymakers would welcome. We want to continue to have that vibrant information. So going to your question about how can policymakers really effectively communicate with the public, it made me think about, when I was heading up the Utility Commission was during the time, and that's when I got to know Dawn, is we were restructuring and executing on electric choice. And so we had, fortunately, a big pot of money that the legislature had funded for the Utility Commission to do just one thing, and that was to educate the public in and around all of ERCOT about electric choice and what that meant. And so we tried to do that in harmony with the retail providers that were coming into the market so that people understood what was happening, what choice meant, how you execute on it. We had a website that we had tailored to that still exists, but it's probably not all that popular anymore. So I think if I were back in that saddle again today, I would be asking the elected officials for money in my budget to go out and campaign, do a communication campaign on what needs to happen, or during some kind of scarcity event again, make sure that you're really sensitive to forecasts and go out there ahead of time to be educating the public of what are some ways you can prepare for something like that, and what are your choices, and what happens if you're in a blackout, or how to remind them how to switch if they need to switch.
Yeah. And thinking about, how much trouble like so many of the retail electric providers are in right now post-storm, I mean, how do you think policymakers can stabilize this market? Is that something that, we need to figure out? Are we going to securitize these costs and make it so that we get some money flowing back into the market to ensure that we don't lose investors? Or I'm just curious about, your thoughts about getting investors to trust in the ERCOT market again.
Well, we are going to securitize. So the question is, we don't know yet exactly who gets to securitize and what costs get to be securitized, because there's competing bills in the legislature right now. Yeah. So we'll probably know in a couple of weeks how that's all going to shake out, and whether retail electric providers get to enjoy some of that securitization eligibility or not. So I think securitizing point blank is, I think, very necessary in order to kind of help smooth the waters for customers and ratepayers at the end of the day, but also provide some kind of backstop during a crazy crisis like this to show the financial market that, we're willing to provide some relief for some of our market participants. And I think that's really important.
Definitely. Don, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, or
No, it's Becky was talking about when we were the information campaign when you were there, and it's kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same. You guys finally got the money, and you could go out and you could start communicating. But I'll remember when the market opened in 2002, we had a budget crisis, and so all the money that had been set up to educate consumers in Texas on what deregulation was going to be like got swept away right at the market opened. So you had all these people that now had the power to choose, the right to choose, and they had no idea what they were choosing. And so Becky is exactly right. If you don't educate the people, the consumers, as to what their options are, what arguably their obligations are, what their rights might be, and what choices they can make, and how that affects not just themselves but the larger market, it's not going to work. I think that you're exactly right. There needs to be, along with all the other money that's going to go in the wake of the winter storm, whether it's securitizing the municipalities and co-ops, or does that extend to private equity? That's the question I've had in my mind. You can see coming into a government, a municipality or a cooperative or somebody that's not private capital, and saying, well, we're going to use community money, we're going to use public money to provide a safety net for that. But at what point do you start getting pushback if you start, a bailout, when you start trying to support private capital? I think that the market participants are just as much victims as the other entities, but I think the political blowback could be a little bit harder to overcome. So I noticed that you positioned that very deftly, but I think that you're right. I think that some will win and some will lose, and then future investors in this market will have to make their own risk assessment before they put their dollars down.
Yeah, I think so.
And I did want to come back to something Cameron had mentioned about Gritty, and how that was an innovative product, but something that clearly failed during this extreme scarcity event. And so how do you all feel about that sort of product in the market, and what sort of guardrails should we have around those?
I'm glad you brought that up. When Cameron said that, I was kind of, wanted to do, I think that what they did, and what we've done miserably as an industry, is ever impart to consumers that there is a difference between the value of electricity at 2 a.m. on a springtime day and midday in August. And so what Gritty did was take that first and very, very painful for them step of raising people's awareness to the fact that not all kilowatt hours are created the same. And it's through that sort of pricing signal and behavioral modification that we're going to start to smooth out our demand curve. So we're going to start to alter behaviors, so where we're going to make the invested capital on the ground last longer. Now, back to communication, I don't think they ever got around to saying, oh, by the way, we can blow your house up with pricing. No one anticipated it. When this, Becky, you were there, we didn't expect to have a week at $9,000. It was supposed to be, a couple of hours here, a couple of hours there. They had a rough go of it in August of 19, and that was just for a few hours here, a few hours there. Yeah. But 5 days at $9,000 is a pretty relentless headwind to try to weather. But I do think that they served a great purpose, in that they brought something different, right? It wasn't free nights and weekends. It was truly educating consumers through their behavior as to the differential values of electricity. And it's that, when you go to the grocery store, you buy certain things that are in season and certain things you don't. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of fundamental commodity awareness is completely lacking from this industry, and always has been. Electricity is seen as a right. You're supposed to be able to turn on your switch and the light comes on. Well, that's fine, but you need to recognize that sometimes turning on that switch is more expensive.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you, to listening to you talk about that, is, is it realistic to expect all consumers to sort of have this sort of awareness and being able to get in on a product and out on a product? And, when I'm buying electricity in Texas, I'm like, man, I just want to pick one and not deal with it for the next 3 years,
Yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And people, it is not a quick learning curve. This is an ingrained notion. There were times when the thought was, and at national level politics, that all electricity is public domain, right? So it's an entitlement almost. And moving people off that thought process and making them responsible for when they spend when they choose to use electricity and what they spend in doing it, that's a behavioral shift that's not going to happen quickly. But they took us down that path. They started us down that path, and I think that was helpful.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, I was a gritty customer right up into the freeze, and so were my parents, and
Just in time, huh?
just in time. The issue.
The freeze coming, and you're like, I gotta switch.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. So the freeze was starting to happen over the weekend, and as we know, transactions really don't happen over the weekend, so switching isn't going to happen until Monday. The issue that I ran into, because I was scurried. You know, I'm completely culpable of my bill if I'm a gritty customer, because I've got this app that's just blowing my phone up, saying, "Hey, you need to switch," you know, for days. And even other retailers were paying their customers $100, or you know, I think Pulse had some type of sweepstake for a Tesla if you could reduce your grid, or reduce your usage. And so, you know, I was culpable of my bill, but I was also scurrying trying to find someone who would take my enrollment. And none of these small or medium retailers that I could find were actually accepting enrollments that Friday, over the weekend, and you know, through the early half of the next week. And so, of course, I had to go to one of the incumbents because, well, they probably can't turn off enrollments either from a political standpoint or just because they can weather the storm, so to speak. So I think, you know, even, you know, Gritty had a very small amount of customers in comparison to how many ratepayers we do have. But I do want to challenge, you know, the thought that, you know, Gritty customers were just naive to the fact that their bills were going sky high, right? Because the whole premise of that company was, you know, almost gamification of usage in comparison to what the price is. And so, you know, I've seen some of their interaction metrics, you know, before the freeze, and their customer interaction was something that isn't even close to a Reliant or someone else. So, you know, I do want to challenge that fact. And, you know, obviously they weren't bailed out, but, you know, the securitization of a lot of the bad debt that's we're going to see soon is going to be bailed out. And so I think that it's a pretty messy job that I wouldn't want to have to kind of figure out who gets left holding the bag. But, you know, that was something that kind of stood out to me.
Yeah, and I staying on this like topic of innovation, especially on the consumer side, you know, what are you all seeing post-storm in terms of what customers are asking for after this, if anything? Like, are you seeing more battery innovation, or like, I want backup generation installed on my house right now?
I wish I had a Generac franchise right now. I can assure you that.
Yeah,
It's,
so I'll answer that question.
that was in your wheelhouse, wasn't it?
It is. So before the storm, we would sell 10% batteries with all of our solar systems. Demand has gone through the roof to where, you know, we've got about 100 people in our company now. We can barely hang on to the demand that we're having now. But I would say 90% of our systems now either have a generator or a battery system tied to the solar system. And so people, though, I think they just don't want that to happen to them again, regardless of the cost. And, you know, battery systems are an exorbitant amount of money to pay for. They don't make sense right now, but in terms of the utility that they give customers from either comfort or being able to sell back, you know, at night or just use it during the day. I think now with an extreme weather event like this, customers are all in. So, you know, it's like I said, it's unfortunate for such a bad event to happen, but I think there has been a behavioral shift in terms of how people are viewing their electricity.
And earlier we talked a little bit about, you were saying that the views on the competitive market have changed a little bit in Texas, post the storm. There's been a lot of conversation about, like, is a competitive market, electricity market, the best thing for Texas? Should we do something that adds more capacity, or should we stick with what we have and maybe add in some guardrails? And so I wanted to go to you, Becky, and talk a little bit about that, because, do you think that this is going to, like, fundamentally change the competitive market in Texas, or do you think that we can continue on this path in the current market structure that we have with maybe some additional stabilizing or some sort of other measures that we can put into place here?
Yeah, of course I have an implicit bias, right? The deregulated market is a big part of my resume, but I really believe that the competitive market is here to stay. And one of the sentinel signals that I get of why that reaffirms my opinion is that if you look at the legislation that's coming out right now or being contemplated and being debated over the last few months, there is nothing that is, well, there are a couple of bills that will ultimately restructure our market, like make it more of a capacity market, but they're not moving. And so the bills that are moving are not related to a fundamental restructuring of a market. Now, I do think there's an opportunity in the summer to do a good study on what are some resource adequacy standards and models for resource adequacy standards that maybe we can incorporate into our market and that align well with our competitive structure, which is 70% competitive and 30% non-competitive. So there's answers out there to make it more robust. I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a competitive market that will be, over a course of time, more robust than it was before. Mm-hmm. And I really feel that we're just on the very advent, the nascent stage of how yours and my relationship with our energy and electricity is going to be changing over a course of time. It's going to be kind of like how our relationship with our telephone has changed drastically. I think we're kind of at the beginning stages of something similar.
And so what do you see, like, 20 years from now, our relationship with our electricity provider, how that would shift?
Just like our cell phones, we're a lot more in control. We could switch easily. We can turn our data on and off. We can augment it. We could hop to different providers, change out our cell phones a lot easier. And also, we seem to be immune to how expensive it is every month. And so I wouldn't be surprised if our electricity bill gets more and more expensive for a variety of reasons, at least for a while, but it's going to have a lot more bells and whistles to come with it as well. Mm-hmm.
I think Moore's Law holds true with a lot of the stuff that we're trying to build in terms of technology. So, solar panels have exponentially becoming cheaper. Mm-hmm. They're becoming more efficient in terms of how much electricity they can generate, and batteries are the same thing. I mean, I'm shocked on how fast battery technologies are coming. Not really the lithium ion phosphate stuff that's inside the batteries, but what we can actually do mm-hmm. with the batteries is absolutely astonishing. So, for example, we have systems now that customers we're taking them essentially off the grid, where batteries they're controlling the power of the home now, so they're interacting with the home's usage, they're interacting with the solar system's production, and they're managing all of that inside of the actual battery's motherboard. So technologies like that becoming, the pace that they're becoming more capable of doing these small interactions where the customer really doesn't have to think is particularly exciting for me. You mentioned 20 years. I think we'll probably be installing these generation systems in customers' homes, and that'll be it. So the big thing, I don't think we've touched on this, is the amount of stranded costs and the seemingly ever rising TDSP costs that we're having to pay for just by maintaining the grid is a little bit variable, but it's also increasing. And so that's where it becomes very exciting to me is, I think energy itself will become very cheap, but the amount of money that it will cost to actually transport it to point A to point B will become very expensive. And so by decentralizing our grid and using it in a very smart way will help us into the future.
And Don, did you want to add anything?
No, I couldn't agree more. Cameron mentioned the word innovation, which is almost something that doesn't get said a lot in the market because there hasn't been any. One of Becky's predecessors, when this market first opened, his biggest concern was that, well, people are going to see a deregulated market, and that means cheaper power. It's just going to be cheaper. And he goes, but yeah, it might over time in the fact that you derive more value. Your phone example is perfectly right. You used to have, you could plug it in the wall and it rang, and that was the extent of what you got, right? And now, call waiting, call answering, call forwarding, those things are so passe. My 3-year-old grandson can program that stuff. And so as that technology becomes ingrained in our society, well, we're the great what's next society. Okay, that was cool. What are we going to do next? And there hasn't been any innovation in this market. And I think, Cameron said it was kind of a rough time for some of the existing retailers, but God, you talk about a Chamber of Commerce brochure for a guy like me that's coming in with a brand new technology and a brand new rep in a dramatically sort of thinned herd. It's a great environment because you have legislators and regulators and most importantly consumers that understand that what we have doesn't work. So what can we do to fix it? And we think we got the answers for it.
Yeah, and I just want to get to another topic just before we go to Q&A because we've got some questions coming in here. But I do want to ask, what do you think the winter storm means for climate change planning and retail electricity? Like, do you think that this has fundamentally changed the way CEOs are looking at climate change, saying like, wow, this is real, this is crazy, I can't believe this happened, and we need to plan for it again? Or do you think most of the market participants are viewing this as a very unusual event that we probably won't need to plan for these sorts of extreme weather events in the future? I don't know if we want to start with Don, since you were...
I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find any Fortune 500 company that doesn't already have a 2030 environmental goal to address and be a good corporate steward in reversing climate change. So I don't think that what happened in Texas in February is going to fundamentally rewrite mission statements. And as I said, I think the February event, trying to find a way to completely guard against a future recurrence is, in my mind, the financial equivalent of buying asteroid insurance. I see it as an aberration. They happen. But again, I don't think it's going to fundamentally reshape corporate behavior because as a group, corporate CEOs, corporate shareholders have all demanded that actions be taken now. And it doesn't matter if it's 2030 or 2035 or 2050, but everybody's put a line in the sand out there to where they're going to materially, if not completely, reduce their carbon footprint. So I don't think that's changing.
Becky, do you think that policymakers will shift their views on this, on climate change because of the storm, or do you think that was...
Well, frankly, I think it would be folly if ERCOT didn't incorporate climate change planning in their demand forecasting that they do yearly. So they certainly undertake scenarios in their forecasting, different economic development scenarios, different, high demand, low demand, medium demand scenarios, but I think they're going to really have to assess also, as far as a policy perspective, is if you incorporate more climate change into your forecasting as far as where the demand curve is going to be year to year, what level of risk does the market want to incorporate that aligns with that kind of climate change assimilation into the forecast? Because risk is expensive, like Don was saying. So it's a balancing act. And I think that's where, a competitive market, each retail electric provider gets to decide what level of risk that they want to take, just like the merchant generators. What level of risk do you want to take? And so when you're when you're not able to provide, whether it's your generation or whether it's the sale of your kilowatt hours, you're paying a huge penalty. So I think it is going to change some planning. I would think it's going to change some planning at ERCOT for sure. But I think that would trickle to the market participants as well.
And I'm going to take some questions from the audience because we've got them flowing in here. But one audience member asks, how do you respond to the recent reports from the Wall Street Journal that Texans pay more under deregulation than other states? I don't know if you all saw that. That came out a month or two ago, but we can start with Becky.
Sure. There's definitely certain assumptions that go under those particular numbers that the Wall Street Journal printed. But if it depends on what standard you're using. I like to use the Energy Information Agency. I think it's very objective. And if you look at December 2020 reports from EIA, that is really something that a lot of planners depend on, not only domestically, but also globally. But EIA was saying that Texas over the last several years has had below average pricing. We've enjoyed retail prices at 11.04 cents, whereas the national average is over 14 cents. Which makes sense, right? Because if you look at our wholesale pricing over the last few years compared to any other place in the United States, it's the lowest wholesale pricing. So it's natural that our retail pricing would also be lower as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. When I was running Power Express a few years ago, we were mainly an online-driven acquisition channel with a niche in apartments, and the online is so competitive just because it's really easy for smaller retailers to participate in, and product structures and so forth even got the attention of the PUC just because of the complication that happened to figure out ways to eke out a few more dollars. And so just by being curious, I was like, gosh, we have to be doing something wrong by the customer. So I did the math and did the planning, and sure enough, even with less desirable products on some channels and so forth, I don't really see that being a reality. I think people in Texas that are participating in the deregulated areas are taking advantage comparatively. But we do have some really good regulated areas too. I mean, Austin Energy has been a leader in some of the renewable initiatives, namely solar. CPS has done the same thing. And so I think just by participating in ERCOT, regardless of whether or not you're regulated or deregulated, we're having a bunch more innovation, and I think we're leading the country in terms of things we're doing to figure out ways to better use our grid.
Another question from the audience. In your opinion, what's the solution for instilling confidence again in the Public Utility Commission and the deregulated market system as a whole? We can go to Becky for that one.
So can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. The solution for instilling confidence again in the Public Utility Commission.
I think that's just going to be merely time and watching how the decisions fall out. So that's all I can say. It's hard to say right now with two brand new commissioners what to expect. They seem to be well qualified. So I think just give them time.
Another question from the audience. One audience member asks, what is a rep's role in protecting their customers? Grid is an example, but to what extent is it the business's responsibility to protect their customers from price spikes?
Other than those customers that were on some version of time of use, notably we've mentioned Griddy, I didn't have a price spike. I mean, I've had a fixed price contract, and my provider honored the fixed price contract. I've got a place in the country that's on a co-op who's now bankrupt, but nonetheless, I didn't have a price spike. So I mean, if you've signed up for a fixed priced agreement and you've read the terms and conditions, and they don't have the ability to. And there was one rep, as I recall, that said, "Oh, well, those ancillary charges, that's one of those unpredictable things, and we're going to raise your rates on that." And that got slapped down pretty quick. But so I'm not aware of any large-scale price gouging or price spikes that got passed on to consumers.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think on the residential side, I mean, there's no way that any rep would be able to reasonably say, yeah, our electricity costs went up, so we're passing it to you. Now, I do think everybody will see that in some form, you know, if we decide to securitize some of these things. So, you know, case in point, Harvey, I don't remember how many hundreds of millions of dollars it was, but, you know, as users of the system, we are the cost causers. So if we're going to be causing the costs, we're going to have to pay for it at some point. But I will say, you know, there was I did get to see a lot of transactions happen after the freeze, and there were some small and medium-sized businesses that were hurt pretty badly. Whether or not that they were, you know, as educated as they should be in entering into some kind of complex rate structure for their business, but the set of rules that protect the residential customer are pretty robust, and the PUC does a great job of policing those rules and making sure that any wrongdoings by the rep are made right. But once you get into a certain size of commercial customer, which really isn't that big, those rules, they're not there. Yeah. So the customer protection rules, there essentially are none. And so ancillary charges and different charges that may have been unhedged and passed through, you know, were passed through to those customers who are going to have to pay those bills.
Yeah. We're quickly running out of time, but I don't know if either of you wanted to mention any closing thoughts before we turn it back over to Integrate.
Nope.
Yeah, I think this has been a great forum, and we could go on and on. You know, one area that we didn't cover is our gas supply area, which I think is just a whole different issue that ultimately affects retail electric providers in the DREG. But I think we have a bright future ahead. Everybody needs to just buckle up and hard work in the meantime.
Yeah. You know, it's one, and adding to that is that in the world of unintended consequences, I mentioned earlier, I'd love to have a Generac dealership. One of the big problems was as gas froze off and gas prices blew up here, you know, the ship channel traded at $400. Everybody has their natural gas fired units now. So the next time we have an outage like this and everybody sparks it up, they may be their own gritty. God knows what it's going to cost them from a gas bill to run all these thousands of new generators that are sitting out next to their house. So we may have an entirely different topic to discuss next time around.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. It was lovely chatting with you, and we'll turn it back over to Integrate.
Thank you so much for tuning in, and a special thank you to our panelist and moderator for joining us today in person for this live interactive panel discussion. We look forward to bringing you more Tilting the Grid events in the near future. Stay tuned.
Oh, thank you.